The morning the mill was gone. The fog came in thick that October morning in 1891. Thomas Hargreaves could taste the coal smoke mixed with river damp as he walked the familiar path to Ashworth Mill, his boots crunching frozen mud. He'd made this walk for 12 years. He knew every turn, every cobblestone, every loose board on the factory bridge. But when he reached the gates at 5:30, something was wrong. The padlock was new, bright brass, not the rusted iron they'd used for years. Behind the gates the yard stood empty. No coal carts, no night watchman's lantern. The loading dock, usually cluttered with crates and timber pallets, had been swept clean. Thomas pressed his face to the iron bars. The main doors to the weaving shed stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, nothing, just empty floor space where 200 power looms had thundered the day before. By 6 o'clock, 40 workers had gathered at those locked gates. No one spoke much. They just stood there, breath clouding in the cold air, staring at a building that had been gutted like a fish. The offices above the engine room, windows dark, curtains gone. The foreman's cabin by the dye house, door hanging open, papers scattered across the threshold. The counting house where they'd lined up for wages just 3 days earlier, empty desks, bare walls, not even a chair left behind. Someone tried the side entrance, unlocked. They filed in slowly, their footsteps echoing on floorboards still stained with machine oil. The smell hit them first. Linseed oil, wool dust, coal tar, the smell of work. But the machinery was gone. Every loom, every spinning frame, every drive belt and pulley wheel. Even the steam engine had been dismantled, leaving only bolt holes in the concrete foundation. In the main weaving hall, someone found a single brass cog lying in the corner, 3 inches across, still warm. The ledgers were missing, the time cards, the payroll books, the orders and invoices. Every scrap of paper that proved Ashworth Mill had been a functioning factory 48 hours ago had vanished. One woman, Margaret Denton, walked to the center of the empty floor and just stood there, turning slowly. She'd worked the 3rd row of looms for 19 years, could tell you exactly how many threads ran through each warp beam, which machines ran hot, which needed oil every 4 hours. Now there was nothing but floorboards and silence. "It's like they were never here," she said quietly. And that was the thing that unsettled them most. This wasn't an abandoned factory. This was a factory that had been erased. Someone had taken extraordinary care to remove every trace of what Ashworth Mill had been. By noon, the police arrived. By evening, reporters from Manchester filled the local taverns, asking questions no one could answer. And as the sun set on that October day, one question hung over the town like smoke. Where had it all gone? A factory with no warning signs. Here's what made it disturbing. Ashworth Mill hadn't been failing. 3 weeks before the disappearance, they'd hired 6 new weavers. 2 weeks before, they'd taken delivery of American cotton worth £300. 1 week before, the owners had renewed the coal contract through March. The order books, according to workers who'd seen them, were full. Blankets for the military, canvas for ship sails, worsted cloth for London tailors. The looms had been running 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Standard output, good quality, no complaints from buyers. James Ashworth, the mill's owner, had seemed in good spirits. He'd walk the floor every morning, checking production numbers, discussing a potential expansion to the south wing. His younger brother Robert handled the accounts and had mentioned to the head dyer that next quarter looked exceptionally promising. The wages were paid on time, always had been. The Ashworth brothers weren't generous, but they weren't cruel either. They ran a typical mid-sized textile operation, profitable but not extravagant, demanding but not dangerous. At least, not by 1891 standards. But when workers started comparing notes after the disappearance, small details emerged. Strange details. A carter named William Blake remembered making late-night deliveries during the final week. He'd arrived at 10 p.m. with timber planking, unusual, but not unheard of. What stuck with him was how quickly they'd unloaded. Usually took an hour with proper stacking. That night, they'd thrown everything into the ground floor and sent him away in 15 minutes. Like they didn't want me seeing something, he said later. A weaver named Sarah Frost mentioned hearing hammering from the upper floors during her last shift. Heavy, rhythmic pounding. She'd asked the foreman about it, said they were reinforcing the storage loft. But Sarah had worked there 8 years and knew the sound of carpentry. This was different, metallic, like someone dismantling machinery, not building shelves. Then there was the foreman himself, Peter Thornley. He'd worked at Ashworth for 23 years, knew every worker by name, lived in a cottage behind the mill. 3 days before the disappearance, he'd stopped coming to the floor, sent messages through his assistant instead, looked pale according to those who saw him, wouldn't meet anyone's eye. On the final day of operation, Thursday, October 15th, several workers noticed something odd. The steam engine was running louder than normal, not rough, just pushing harder. The pressure gauge needle stayed higher than usual. The chief engineer, Arthur Grimes, kept adjusting the throttle, but the sound persisted. "It's fine," he told them, "just breaking in some new fittings." But Arthur Grimes had also vanished, along with James and Robert Ashworth, Peter Thornley, and the mill's bookkeeper. 5 men gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye, no explanation. The textile industry in Lancashire was cutthroat, yes. Mills rose and fell, but they died publicly. There were auctions, creditor notices, final shifts where workers carried out what they could. Factories closed, but they didn't evaporate. And Ashworth Mill hadn't just closed. It had been systematically emptied with surgical precision in less than 48 hours. Every piece of equipment removed, every document cleared, every trace of industrial activity swept away. That required planning, resources, absolute secrecy. Something had gone very wrong at Ashworth Mill. And someone had decided the best solution was to make it disappear. The hidden problems no one talked about. The official investigation turned up nothing. No bankruptcy filing. No outstanding debts large enough to explain the abandonment. No lawsuits on record. James Ashworth's banking records showed modest profits, regular transactions, nothing unusual. His brother Robert's accounts were similar, conservative, stable, unremarkable. But the absence of evidence is itself evidence. Victorian factory owners kept meticulous records. They had to. Investors demanded it. Tax collectors required it. Insurance companies insisted on detailed logs of equipment, production, and incidents. The fact that every document from Ashworth Mill had been removed suggested someone was hiding something they couldn't afford to have documented. So what were the possibilities? The first whisper that circulated was about the machinery itself. Several workers mentioned that new equipment had been installed in the upper floors during the summer. They'd never seen it, only heard it running. Strange rhythms, odd vibrations that traveled through the building's timber frame. One weaver described it as like a heartbeat, but wrong. Experimental machinery wasn't uncommon in 1891. The textile industry was obsessed with innovation. Faster looms, stronger threads, automated systems that could replace skilled workers. But experimental equipment was also dangerous. New designs meant new failure points. Higher speeds meant higher stresses. And when things went wrong with steam-powered machinery, they went wrong catastrophically. A boiler explosion could kill dozens. A flywheel failure could send half-ton metal discs through brick walls. Drive shafts spinning at 300 revolutions per minute could tear a human body apart if clothing got caught. Factory owners lived in terror of the kind of industrial accident that would destroy their reputation, trigger lawsuits, and bring regulatory scrutiny. If something on those upper floors had failed badly enough, killed workers, perhaps, or demonstrated a fundamental design flaw that threatened future operations, the owners might have decided erasure was safer than explanation. Then there was the child labor angle. By 1891, Britain had laws restricting children under 10 from factory work and limiting hours for older children. But enforcement was spotty, especially in smaller operations. Several former workers mentioned seeing young boys around the mill in the final months. Piecers, they said, children who mended broken threads on the looms. Legal for children over 10, but only if school attendance and working hours were properly documented. If Ashworth Mill had been using underage workers illegally, and if an inspector had been scheduled to visit, a sudden disappearance could erase the evidence before charges were filed. There were also darker possibilities. Industrial disease was rampant. Lung conditions from cotton dust, poisoning from chemical dyes, skin diseases from contaminated wool. If workers had been getting sick at unusual rates, especially from a new process or chemical, and if they'd begun talking about legal action, the owners might have chosen to vanish rather than face the financial ruin of compensation claims. Some speculated about insurance fraud. Burn the mill, claim the loss, start fresh elsewhere. But Ashworth Mill hadn't burned. It had been carefully dismantled. That suggested the machinery itself had value worth preserving, but only if it was removed from this particular location. Or perhaps it was debt, not the official kind that appeared in bank records, but private loans, the sort of arrangements desperate men make with dangerous people. If James Ashworth had borrowed money he couldn't repay, a midnight evacuation might have been preferable to facing those creditors. The truth, most likely, was some combination. Victorian factories were pressure vessels in more ways than one. Financial stress, mechanical danger, legal exposure, workplace secrets, all of it compressed together under the relentless demand for profit. When the pressure became too much, the whole system could rupture. And when it did, those with the most to lose found ways to disappear. The rumors that spread across town. The silence from the Ashworth brothers made everything worse. Silence creates space, and people filled it with stories. Within days, the town was alive with rumors. A railway porter named George Hancock swore he'd seen 3 freight wagons being loaded at the mill's private siding at 2 in the morning, just before the disappearance. He'd been walking home from a late shift and heard the machinery, not the looms, but something heavier. Steam winches, maybe. The sound of metal on metal. When he'd walked closer, 2 men he didn't recognize had told him to move along. They weren't local, George insisted. Manchester accents, professional-like. The kind of men who work night removals and don't ask questions. A woman who lived on the hill overlooking the mill claimed she'd seen lanterns moving inside the building for 2 straight nights. Not the usual night watchman's routine, dozens of lights, moving systematically from room to room, floor to floor. Like they were searching for something, she said, or taking inventory. Then there was Peter Thornley, the vanished foreman. His wife Elizabeth still lived in the cottage. She wouldn't speak to reporters, but neighbors said she'd been seen burning papers in her garden the night after the disappearance. Letters, they thought, maybe documents from the mill. When someone finally worked up the courage to ask her directly, Elizabeth Thornley had said only, "My husband did what he had to do, that's all." The workers themselves were furious, not just at losing their jobs, that was common enough in industrial Lancashire, but at the way it had been done. No warning, no final wages, no explanation. Some families had depended on that mill income for generations. Margaret Denton's grandmother had worked there. Sarah Frost's father had died in an accident on the floor 20 years earlier. These weren't just employees. They were people whose lives had been woven into the mill's existence. And now they were cut loose, with no reference letters, no final pay packets, and no one to answer their questions. The anger turned to desperation. Several workers travelled to Manchester looking for James Ashworth. They found his townhouse shuttered, his club membership cancelled. His solicitor claimed no knowledge of his whereabouts. His bank said he'd closed his accounts and transferred everything to a London institution, which was entirely his right. Robert Ashworth's family had also vanished. His wife, his 2 children, the governess, gone. The house stood empty, furniture still inside, as if they'd left for a weekend trip and never returned. Arthur Grimes, the chief engineer, was eventually found. A journalist tracked him to Liverpool, working under a different name at a shipyard. When confronted, Grimes had been blunt. I signed something. I can't talk about Ashworth. I won't talk about it. You do well to stop asking. That phrase, I signed something, suggested non-disclosure agreements, legal documents binding the key employees to silence, which meant lawyers had been involved, which meant this disappearance had been planned carefully with legal protection in place. The stories grew stranger. Some claimed they'd seen James Ashworth boarding a ship to America. Others said he'd died, and the family was covering it up to avoid estate taxes. A few whispered that the mill had been a front for something else entirely, smuggling, perhaps, or counterfeiting, and the authorities were close to discovering it. The most disturbing rumor came from a former maintenance worker named Joseph Mills. He claimed that during the final week, he'd been told to brick up a section of the basement. Not repair, brick up. Seal off a storage area beneath the engine room. When he'd asked why, the foreman had told him to do it or find other work. I bricked it up, Joseph said later, but I heard something before I sealed it, breathing, like someone was down there. No one believed him. Joseph Mills was known to drink. But when someone checked the basement after the disappearance, they found fresh brickwork exactly where he described. Solid, professional, permanent. No one wanted to take down to see what was behind it. What modern historians think happened. A century later, we can make educated guesses. The most likely explanation involves mechanical failure and financial panic. Industrial historians who have studied similar disappearances point to a pattern. Mills that installed experimental equipment ran into catastrophic problems and found themselves facing ruin. Here's the scenario. Ashworth Mill invested in new machinery, probably an advanced loom system or experimental steam engine, during the summer of 1891. These weren't simple devices. Victorian industrial equipment was powerful, complex, and often poorly understood even by the engineers who operated it. A design flaw might not reveal itself for months. When the equipment finally failed, it likely did so dramatically. Maybe it destroyed other machinery. Maybe it injured or killed workers in a way that would have triggered massive liability claims. Maybe it simply proved the entire investment was worthless, and the Ashworths realized they were facing bankruptcy. But here's the critical part. They'd probably borrowed money to finance the purchase. Not from banks kept records, but from private investors. Wealthy backers who expected returns and didn't take kindly to hearing their capital had been vaporized by a failed experiment. Faced with financial ruin, legal action, and possibly criminal prosecution if workers had died and been covered up, the Ashworth brothers made a calculated decision: disappear the evidence. Hire professional removal crews, dismantle everything. Remove the failed machinery before anyone could examine it. Take the documents that showed the investments and debts. Pay off key employees with non-disclosure agreements. And vanish. The mill building itself was probably leased, not owned. That's why it was left standing. The equipment was the valuable part, and the valuable part had problems they couldn't afford to document. This theory explains several things: the professional efficiency of the removal, the legal agreements binding employees to silence, the absence of any paper trail, and the Ashworths' complete disappearance from Lancashire. Another possibility involves industrial espionage. The textile industry was viciously competitive. If Ashworth Mill had developed or acquired a genuinely innovative process, a new dyeing technique, a superior weaving method, a more efficient power system, and if competitors had gotten wind of it, the midnight evacuation might have been an attempt to relocate the technology before it could be stolen or replicated. This would explain why the machinery was so carefully removed rather than sold at auction. They needed it intact. They needed it somewhere else. And they needed absolute secrecy to prevent competitors from following. Some historians favor the child labor theory. Documentary evidence from other mills in the period shows that factories routinely falsified records when inspectors approached. If Ashworth Mill had been flagrantly violating child labor laws, using children under 10, working them excessive hours, putting them in dangerous positions, And if a major inspection had been scheduled, the owners might have chosen to shut down completely rather than face criminal charges. Victorian factory owners had been imprisoned for child labour violations. Their mills had been closed by court order. For men of social standing, the shame alone would have been unbearable. Disappearing was extreme, but possibly preferable to public scandal and incarceration. The darkest theory involves an industrial accident that was deliberately concealed. If the experimental machinery had killed workers, and if the bodies had been disposed of rather than reported, the owners would have faced manslaughter charges. In that scenario, the midnight evacuation wasn't just about protecting financial interests, it was about avoiding prison. Joseph Mills's story about sealing up the basement adds weight to this theory. What was behind that brick wall, broken machinery, incriminating documents, or something worse? We'll never know. The building was demolished in 1923. The basement was filled with rubble. Whatever secrets it held are buried beneath a car park now. What we do know is this. The Industrial Revolution created enormous wealth and transformed Britain into a global power. But it also created spaces where rules could be bent, lives could be discarded, and inconvenient truths could be erased. Factories were private kingdoms. What happened inside was largely invisible to the outside world. If an owner decided to hide something, they had the resources, the connections, and the legal framework to make it happen. Ashworth Mill wasn't unique. It was just more thorough than most. The workers who showed up that October morning to find their livelihoods erased weren't owed explanations in the eyes of those who disappeared. They were replaceable. Their questions were inconvenient. Their memories were irrelevant. So the mill vanished, and the men who owned it vanished, and the truth vanished with them. And that, in the end, might be the most Victorian thing about the whole story. This wasn't just a factory disappearing. It was a piece of history deliberately erased.